I was standing in the middle of the crosswalk, the sound of impatient car horns blaring behind me, my hand steadying the frail arm of a woman who looked like she'd stepped straight out of a black and white photograph. Her small fingers clutched mine with surprising strength as she shuffled forward, her steps slow but deliberate. The light was already flashing red for pedestrians, and I could feel the tension of the drivers waiting for us to move. That's when I saw her, standing on the other side of the street, holding a paper bag from the corner bakery, her long brown hair catching the late afternoon sunlight in a way that made everything else blur. I didn't know it then, but that moment, with my heart racing from the pressure of the traffic and the unexpected connection of our eyes, would be the exact second my entire life began to change. The old woman squeezed my hand, almost as if she knew something I didn't, and when we finally reached the curb, the young woman stepped forward with a warm smile. "Thank you for helping my grandmother," she said, her voice soft but with a confidence that caught me off guard. I managed a smile, trying to ignore the fact that my palms were suddenly sweaty. What I didn't know was that helping a stranger cross the street would set off a chain of events that would lead to love, heartbreak, and a decision that would test everything I thought I knew about commitment. She shifted the bakery bag in her arms and introduced herself as Emily, and in that instant I realized she had the kind of presence that made you feel like you'd known her longer than the 30 seconds you'd been standing there. The old woman smiled knowingly, patting my arm before shuffling toward the building behind them. Emily explained that her grandmother, Margaret, came to that bakery every Thursday at the same time, and that she usually met her there after work, but today she'd been running late. "I'm glad you were here to help," she said, her eyes holding mine in a way that made it hard to think of anything clever to say. I told her it was no problem, that I was just on my way to grab coffee before heading home. She glanced at her watch, then back at me, and said, "Maybe I can buy you that coffee. Consider it a thank you." My brain scrambled for an answer, part of me surprised at the offer, the other part already imagining the two of us sitting across from each other in a small cafe, laughing over steaming cups. I agreed, and we walked to a place around the corner, the air between us comfortable but filled with that quiet energy that only happens when you meet someone you know you want to see again. Over coffee, we talked about work. She was a graphic designer freelancing for small businesses, and about how she moved to the city 2 years ago to be closer to her grandmother after her parents retired abroad. I told her I worked in IT but was trying to figure out what I really wanted from life, which earned me a small, understanding smile. By the time our cups were empty, I knew two things: one, that this was not going to be the last time we saw each other, and two, that I'd never look at a busy crosswalk the same way again. When we said goodbye, she thanked me again, but her eyes said something else entirely, something that made me want to find out exactly what it was. For the next week I found excuses to pass that corner, late lunches that just happened to coincide with Margaret's Thursday bakery run, evening walks that looped an unnecessary block so I could check if the little bell over the cafe door would ring and reveal Emily's silhouette. On Thursday I finally saw them again, Margaret in her wool coat with the pearl buttons, Emily beside her, head tipped toward her grandmother, as if every word mattered. I almost kept walking, suddenly 14 again with no idea what to do with my hands, but Margaret spotted me first and lifted a gloved hand like a tiny traffic cop. "Our hero," she announced, and I felt my ears go hot as Emily laughed. She introduced me properly this time, not as the guy from the crosswalk but as Noah, which sounded unexpectedly right in her mouth. We walked Margaret to her bus stop, and when the bus pulled away Emily didn't rush off. She shifted her tote higher on her shoulder and said, "I owe you a coffee I didn't really get to buy last time." We went back to the same cafe, the kind with mismatched mugs and a barista who looked like he'd been born rolling his eyes at milk alternatives. Conversation slid into place like a drawer on good runners. I learned she had a rule about never using the same font twice in a week, that she still texted her high school art teacher for feedback on big projects, that she hated cilantro with a zeal usually reserved for sports rivalries. I told her about my first disastrous attempt to fix my own laptop fan. Superglue was involved, about the grandmother who'd taught me to bake banana bread every Sunday, about the way my job paid the bills but never lit anything up inside me. She asked what would. I didn't have a tidy answer. Saying, "I don't know," felt both terrifying and like a relief I had been postponing for years. She didn't flinch. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, as if we were the most obvious thing in the world. When we left, the sky was the thin blue of winter getting ready to give up, and she walked me to the corner where we'd first met. At the curb we paused like the city itself had put a hand on our shoulders. "Same time next week?" she asked, hopeful but not needy, the exact frequency my heart didn't know it was tuned to. I nodded, and we set a rule: no texting until then, no safety net, just to see if anticipation could still exist in a world that chews through patience like candy. It did. The week that followed stretched in the sweetest, most excruciating way. I caught myself noting small things to tell her: how the florist on 9th sold ranunculus that looked like paper lanterns, how a stray cat had decided my stoop was Switzerland, how a line of code finally worked after 2 days of failing and I'd done a silent fist pump in an open office. On Thursday at 4:57 I was already outside the bakery pretending to examine a poster about a neighborhood cleanup when she appeared, cheeks pink from the cold, a wisp of hair untucked from her scarf. "You're early," she said. "You too," I said, which was true because Margaret was nowhere in sight. Emily glanced at the door, then at me. "She's skipping today, book club mutiny." She bit her lip. "You could still walk someone across the street, though." I offered my arm in mock formality. She slipped her hand through with a grin that felt like sunlight. We crossed with the light, perfectly ordinary and completely not, and somewhere between one curb and the other I realized I was already rehearsing the story I'd tell if anyone ever asked how we met. That night we didn't go to the cafe. Instead, she suggested a tiny ramen shop tucked between a laundromat and a locksmith, the kind of place you'd miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. The air inside was rich with steam and the kind of smell that makes you hungry before you've even seen a menu. We squeezed into a corner booth and ended up talking so long the owner brought us free tea just to keep us there. Emily told me about her parents, how they'd retired to Portugal and sent her photos of sunsets over the ocean like it was their personal duty to make her jealous. She showed me a picture of her grandmother in her 20s, hair tied back, eyes mischievous, holding a paintbrush like she might stab the camera with it. I told her about my younger brother, who'd moved across the country and whose absence I felt most on Sundays, the day we'd grown up calling pancake mornings. She asked if I still made pancakes. I admitted I didn't, mostly because eating them alone felt like breaking some unspoken rule. Her face softened, and she said maybe we could fix that. Somewhere between the miso broth and the soft-boiled egg, I caught myself studying her in that dangerous way, where you're not just noticing a person, you're memorizing them. The way her hands punctuated her sentences, the way her laugh tipped just slightly higher when something truly caught her off guard, the way her eyes didn't dart away when silence fell. When the check came, I reached for it, but she shook her head. "You're still the guy who saved my grandmother from the horrors of an unassisted crosswalk. I think I can buy you dinner." On the walk back, the streets were slick from a light rain, neon signs shimmering in puddles. We paused at the bakery corner again, out of habit, though there was no grandmother to escort and no light to wait for. She hesitated, then said, "I had a really good time tonight." I told her I had too, and the quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind that hums with the sense that something's about to shift. She stepped closer, and for a heartbeat I thought she might kiss me. Instead, she rested her head briefly against my shoulder and whispered, "See you next week." Then she was gone, disappearing into the glow of a street lamp like a scene I'd replay in my head more times than I'd admit. By the third Thursday, the weekly coffee had quietly evolved into something neither of us had labeled but both of us anticipated. It wasn't just coffee anymore, it was a standing appointment with possibility. That afternoon I arrived at the bakery corner a few minutes early, only to find Emily already there, leaning against the window with 2 cups in her hands. "Figured I'd save us the trouble," she said, handing me one. It was exactly how I take it: no sugar, extra hot, and I realized she'd been paying closer attention than I thought. Margaret joined us this time, shuffling out of the bakery with a loaf of sourdough wrapped in paper. "I see you two have found a rhythm," she teased, eyes glinting, before claiming the middle seat at a small outdoor table. We talked about everything from the best croissants in the city to whether pigeons have a secret hierarchy. And when Margaret left to catch her bus, Emily didn't make a move to leave. Instead, she asked if I wanted to walk her home. The streets were buzzing with that early evening energy, shop lights flicking on, laughter spilling from open restaurant doors, the faint sound of a busker's guitar somewhere down the block. We took the long way, detouring through a park where the leaves had started to turn gold and rust under the dim street lamps. At one point she stopped to watch a group of kids chase each other around the playground, her expression soft and far away. I asked what she was thinking, and she said, "Just how fast everything changes. A year ago I was working at a job I hated, living in an apartment with a leaky ceiling, barely making it. Now I'm here, and it's different. Better. And I'm scared to mess it up." The words hung between us, heavier than the air. I didn't know what she meant exactly, whether better included me, but I wanted it to. I told her I understood, that I'd been feeling something similar without knowing how to put it into words. We walked the rest of the way to her building in comfortable silence, and when we reached the steps, she lingered like she didn't quite want the night to end. "Next week?" she asked, her voice quieter now. I nodded, and as she turned to go, I felt an almost physical pull to follow. But I stayed where I was, watching until her door closed, the warm light from her hallway spilling onto the sidewalk before disappearing. The next Thursday didn't go as planned. I'd been buried in a mess at work, server outage, angry clients, a manager pacing behind my chair like he thought glaring would fix the code. By the time I shut down my computer, I was already 15 minutes late. I sprinted the last block to the bakery corner, breath clouding in the chilly air, only to find Emily standing alone with her arms crossed, the paper bag from the bakery at her feet. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Rough day?" she asked. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Server meltdown. Everything that could go wrong did." She handed me a cup of coffee, lukewarm now, and said, "Well, you missed the excitement. Some guy tried to cut in front of my grandma in line and she tore into him like she was defending a championship title." I laughed, imagining it, but something in her tone felt off. We started walking, and after a few blocks she asked, "Can I tell you something without you getting weird about it?" My stomach tightened. "Sure." She hesitated, then said, "My ex texted me today. Nothing big, just, he saw me at the park last week and wanted to say hi. But it made me realize how much I don't want to go back to that part of my life." She glanced at me, gauging my reaction. I forced a casual smile, though my mind was racing. "Sounds like you already know what you want," I said. "Yeah," she murmured. "But it's still strange, seeing pieces of your past walking around the same city." We didn't talk much after that. The air between us felt different, still warm, but with a thin edge I couldn't name. At her building, she paused like she usually did, but this time there was no lingering, no hesitant smile. Just a soft, "See you next week," and the quiet thud of her door closing behind her. I stood there longer than I should have, the sound of the lock sliding into place ringing louder in my head than it should have. The following week I showed up early, 15 minutes early, to make up for last time. The bakery door jingled, and I expected to see Emily walk out with Margaret, but instead it was just Margaret, her brow furrowed and a knit hat pulled low over her ears. "Emily's not coming today," she said before I could even ask. "Work emergency." She hesitated, then added, "She told me to tell you she's sorry." We walked toward her bus stop in the brittle cold, my mind spinning with questions I didn't ask. Margaret talked about her book club's latest drama, but every word passed through me like static. When her bus pulled away, I found myself standing on the sidewalk, staring at the bakery door like maybe Emily would appear after all. I finally left, walking aimlessly until I ended up near the park we'd passed that night after ramen. The swings creaked in the wind, the playground empty except for a man tossing a ball for his dog. I was about to turn back when I saw her, Emily, across the park, talking to someone. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and standing a little too close. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way she shifted her weight, half smiling, told me it wasn't a stranger. My first instinct was to walk over, but something in me froze. Instead, I watched as he handed her something, a small envelope, and she slipped it into her coat pocket before hugging him quickly and stepping away. She didn't see me. I left before she could. That night I couldn't shake the image of that envelope. The next morning, I almost texted her to ask, but stopped. We weren't anything official. We hadn't even kissed. Still, there was a knot in my chest I couldn't untangle. When Thursday rolled around again, she was there, waiting with coffee in hand, her smile brighter than it had been in weeks. She didn't mention missing last week. I didn't mention the park. But the whole time, I couldn't stop wondering if that envelope had her ex's handwriting on it. The coffee was warm in my hands, but my stomach was cold with the weight of what I hadn't said. We walked toward the park like we usually did, her talking about a new design project while I nodded at all the right moments, barely hearing a word. The envelope sat like a ghost in the back of my mind, haunting every step. At one point she stopped to point out a storefront that had just opened, her eyes lighting up the way they did when she found something beautiful in an unexpected place. I smiled, but it felt mechanical. "You're quiet today," she said, tilting her head to look at me. I shrugged. "Just tired." It was a lie, and we both knew it. We reached a bench near the fountain and sat, watching pigeons fight over a piece of bread. The words were right there, sitting on the tip of my tongue. Who was he? What was in that envelope? But I bit them back. Asking might break whatever this was before it had the chance to become anything. But not asking was its own kind of slow poison. Emily glanced at her phone, then tucked it back into her pocket. "Sorry," she said. "Just my grandma checking in." I wanted to believe her. I really did. Instead, I forced a grin and changed the subject, asking about her favorite travel destination. She launched into a story about visiting Paris in college, and I tried to focus on the way her hands moved as she spoke, the way her eyes softened when she talked about walking along the Seine. But underneath it all was the steady hum of a question I wasn't ready to ask, a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to know. When we finally said goodbye, she hugged me for the first time. Her coat smelled faintly of cinnamon. It should have been enough. But as I walked away, I realized the hug had only made the knot in my chest tighter. It was the Saturday after that hug when I saw him again, the same tall man in the dark coat. I wasn't even supposed to be in that part of town, but a last-minute errand had taken me past a quiet little cafe I'd never noticed before. Through the window, I spotted Emily, sitting at a corner table with him. No bakery bag, no grandmother, just the two of them, leaning in close over steaming mugs. My first thought was to turn around and walk away before they saw me, but my legs didn't listen. I froze there on the sidewalk, hidden just enough by the glare on the glass. Emily was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on the table dangerously close to his. It wasn't quite touching, but close enough that my pulse kicked up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like the same envelope I'd seen in the park, only this time, she opened it right there. I couldn't see what was inside, but I saw her expression change, something between nostalgia and hesitation, and then she slid whatever it was back in and tucked it into her bag. A minute later, she glanced toward the window, and my heart stopped. But she didn't see me. She was looking past me at the street, distracted. I stepped back into the shadow of a doorway until they both stood and left together, walking in the opposite direction. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The image was already burned into my brain. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every conversation we'd had, looking for cracks, for clues I'd missed. Part of me wanted to call her, to demand answers. But another part, maybe the more cowardly part, wanted to wait, to let her tell me in her own time. The problem was, I wasn't sure which part of me was right. The next Thursday, I didn't plan to play it safe. I arrived early again, determined that this time I'd get the truth. When Emily walked up, her smile was as bright as ever, but I could feel my own expression was tighter, my jaw set. We started toward the park, the familiar route, but halfway there I stopped. Emily, I said, and my voice came out sharper than I meant. She paused, eyebrows lifting. What's wrong? The words spilled before I could second-guess them. Who is he? The guy from the park. And the cafe. And the envelope, what is that? Her mouth opened slightly, like I'd caught her mid-step in a dance she didn't know she was performing. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she sighed, looking away toward the street. You saw us. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my pulse hammering. She was quiet for so long I thought she might just walk away. But finally she said, His name is Ryan. He's my ex. We were together for 4 years, and it ended badly. The envelope was… She hesitated, biting her lip. Letters. Ones he wrote after we broke up. He wanted me to have them to… I don't know, remember him, I guess. The words hit me like a cold wind. Why didn't you tell me? She met my eyes then, and I saw something raw there, not guilt, exactly, but a kind of tangled sadness. Because I didn't want you to think you were a replacement. Or that I wasn't over him. I am. But sometimes parts of the past sneak back in, and you don't know how to handle it without hurting the people you care about. My chest tightened at those last words, people you care about. So what do you want? I asked. She took a step closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of coffee on her breath. I want to keep seeing you. I want to see where this goes. But I also need you to trust that my past isn't my present. I wanted to believe her. And maybe I did. But I also knew that once you've seen a crack in the glass, you can't unsee it. I told myself I'd believe her. I told myself I'd let it go. For the first few days, I even managed to convince myself I'd done exactly that. We still met on Thursdays, still walked the same route, still had coffee that always tasted better when she handed it to me. But once you've pulled at a thread, you can't stop noticing it. The first thing was her phone. She'd always kept it face up on the table before, notifications lighting up without her caring. Now it was always flipped over. Small thing, maybe nothing, but it landed in my gut like a stone. Then there was the bakery bag. She used to buy the same loaf of bread for her grandmother every time, but last Thursday, she left with a smaller bag, and when I joked about Margaret cutting carbs, she just said, It's not for her, and changed the subject. And then, Friday night, I saw her name flash across my phone. A text. Can't make it tomorrow, work thing. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled. We'd never met on a Friday. Why explain an absence that wasn't on the calendar? By Saturday, the thought had rooted in my brain, was she seeing him again? I hated the paranoia creeping into me, the way it made me read meaning into everything she did. But I couldn't stop. The following Thursday, she showed up late, cheeks flushed like she'd been rushing. Sorry, she said. Last-minute call from a client. I nodded, smiling like it didn't bother me. But all I could hear was the echo of my own doubts. We walked and talked and laughed as usual, but I kept catching myself studying her face, looking for signs of a lie I wasn't sure existed. At her building, she hugged me again, tighter than before, and for a second, I thought maybe I was wrong, maybe this was just my own insecurity making a mess of something good. But then she pulled away, and I saw the edge of a small white envelope peeking out of her coat pocket. The same kind as before. I couldn't stop staring at that envelope. It felt like a physical thing between us, heavier than the space in the air. She noticed my eyes drop to her pocket, and her hand instinctively brushed against it, like she was tucking it deeper out of sight. That tiny motion was the last straw. Is that from him? The words came out sharper than I intended, slicing through the cool evening air. Emily froze on the steps of her building, one hand still in her pocket. Noah, she started, but I didn't let her finish. Don't tell me it's nothing. I've seen you with him. I've seen the envelopes. I've heard the excuses. If we're doing this, whatever this is, you can't keep lying to me. Her eyes flashed, not with guilt, but with something hotter. Lying? I told you what those letters were. You're the one who decided that wasn't enough. Because it's not enough. My voice rose before I could stop it. Do you have any idea what it's like to feel like you're competing with someone who isn't even here anymore? To wonder every time you smile at me if you're remembering something he said instead? She shook her head, stepping down one step toward me. You think this is about him? It's not. It's about you not trusting me to make my own choices. Those letters, their closure, Noah. I never read them when we broke up because I was too angry. He's giving them to me now, and I need to decide if I want to finally open that chapter, or burn it. And what happens if you read them and realize you made a mistake leaving him? I asked, quieter now but no less desperate. She took a long breath, her gaze steady on mine. Then I'll know. And you'll know. But if you can't stand beside me while I figure that out, maybe you're not ready for me either. The street was silent except for the faint hum of traffic in the distance. My chest felt tight, like the air itself had turned against me. She stepped back up, turned her key in the door, and before going inside she said, I'll call you when I've decided. And just like that, she was gone, leaving me staring at a closed door, wondering if I'd just lost her for good. The days that followed felt like I was living in a house where every clock had stopped. Time moved, but I couldn't feel it. Every morning I'd wake up reaching for my phone, half expecting a message from her, and every morning the screen stared back at me, blank. At work, I stared at lines of code without really seeing them, my thoughts looping back to that last look in her eyes, steady, certain, and yet impossibly far away. By the third day, I'd convinced myself she wasn't going to call. That this was her way of letting me down without having to say the words out loud. And maybe that was better, cleaner, than dragging it out. But the thing about clean endings is that they still cut deep. On the fourth night, I found myself walking past her building without really meaning to. The bakery corner was dark, the chairs stacked inside. Her windows were lit, but the curtains were drawn. I stood across the street like a stranger, wondering if she was inside with the letters, with him, or maybe with either, maybe just alone, deciding her life in a way I had no control over. I thought about calling, about knocking, about saying something, anything, that might pull her back into my orbit. But my feet stayed planted. The next morning, I went for a run before work, trying to sweat her out of my system. It didn't work. Every song in my playlist seemed to echo pieces of her voice, her laugh, the way she'd tilt her head when she was about to say something she wasn't sure she should. By the end of the week, I wasn't just missing her, I was missing the version of myself I'd been around her. The lighter, more open version. And I hated that I didn't know if I'd get him back, with or without her. It was late Sunday night when my phone finally lit up with her name. For a moment, I just stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen like answering would set off some chain reaction I couldn't stop. When I finally swiped to pick up, my voice came out rough. Emily? There was a pause, the faint sound of her breathing, before she said, Can we meet? Now. 10 minutes later, I was standing outside the bakery corner, hands shoved deep in my pockets against the cold. She appeared from the shadows, coat buttoned all the way to her chin, hair pulled back like she'd left the house in a hurry. I read them, she said without preamble. My chest tightened. And? Her eyes searched mine, and in that moment I knew the answer could go either way. They didn't change anything. They just reminded me why it ended, and why it needs to stay that way. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed, but there was something in her face that kept me still. But, she continued, they also made me realize how much space I've let him take up in my head. Space I can't give to someone else until I clear it out completely. I swallowed. So where does that leave us? She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the way her breath fogged in the cold air. It leaves us with a choice. We can try this, really try, or we can walk away now before it gets harder. My mind raced with every moment we'd shared, from that first coffee to the way she'd hugged me outside her building. I wanted to say yes without thinking. But I also knew that trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight. If we try, I said slowly, it has to be with everything on the table. No more envelopes, no more hiding things. She nodded, her gaze steady. Agreed. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, like it was the most natural thing in the world, she reached for my hand. And just like that, the knot in my chest loosened, not gone, but finally starting to unravel. It's been 3 months since that night outside the bakery. We've had good days and bad, laughs that felt like new beginnings, and arguments that reminded us just how fragile trust can be. The envelopes are gone. She burned them one rainy Sunday, standing beside me in her tiny kitchen, watching the paper curl and blacken in the sink. I thought that would be the end of it, the clean break we needed, but healing is slower than fire. There are still moments when I catch myself wondering what was written in those letters, and moments when I see her stare off like she's somewhere I can't follow. But there are also mornings when I wake up to her hand curled in mine and realize that sometimes, choosing to stay is the braver thing. I don't know where we'll be in a year, or even in 6 months. All I know is that right now, we're both still here, still trying, and maybe that's enough. Or maybe it's just the start of a bigger heartbreak. What would you do? Keep walking forward, or step away before it's too late?